Hello and welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Okay, those who are able to, that you can see me also. My name is Melis Jikalu. I use she and her pronouns. I am currently based in Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. For those who need a bit of a visual description, I am a Black cisgender female presenting person. I have Black Afro hair. I'm wearing a pair of patterned glasses, wearing this kind of light blue shirt and sitting in what looks like a bird cage, but is actually my chair. For those of you who don't know me, I am a transformational coach and consultant. And I'm also the program director of We Create Space. So it's so thrilling to be able to bring these panel series to you over the last 6 weeks. We Create Space, if you don't know about us, well, we're a community-led platform, a consultancy, and a collective of queer change makers, really on this mission to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people around the world. And we currently support over 100 corporate partners at varying stages of their DEI journey. And so through consultancy, we design shared experiences, we produce DEI insights, and craft bespoke content that supports individuals with strengthening their roles as change agents within their communities and organizations. And as a social enterprise, we're actually quite proud to say that, all of the profit that we make goes back into the LGBTQ plus community and what offers resources like these, free events, both in person and online, resources as well that we produce, leadership development opportunities and wellbeing solutions. And probably we've, over the last 2 years, delivered over 1,000 plus events and shared experiences and invested over £350,000 back into the LGBTQ plus community. This would not have been possible without the support people like yourselves. And so here are a couple of things that we'd love to share for you to know a bit more about how to get involved. First things first, well, you can continue doing what you're doing now, which is attending our events. So thank you once again for being here. And you can also share our social posts. We're on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and most of the platforms. And so it would be interesting for you to share, to connect with us as well, amplify also our speakers' voices, their projects, their posts as well. And if you do wish to, also introduce us to your employer colleagues if any of the work that we do resonates. So if it's your first time, please feel free to reach out to myself or my team to ask any further questions. But for now, that's all we can share with you right now. On today's menu, however, we have quite an insightful conversation. I believe I'm ready with all of my notes, but I'm so excited to explore this topic on queer leadership, intergenerational wisdom, looking at the role of mentoring in queer leadership development. So we will be sharing some personal experiences. Our panelists here will be leaning into also their professional experiences, but we just invite you to engage with this session in a way that best supports your well-being. We're here to support if you have any tech issues or if anything else that's coming up, please feel free to reach out. We will do our part in issuing any trigger warnings where necessary, but primarily we'll do our best to offer solution-focused perspectives to help drive positive change and transformation in our communities and workplaces. Right, I have the pleasure of now passing the mic to Ujix Smith, who is our moderator for today. Ujix, please kick us off and lead the introduction for all the other panelists as well who are here. Thank you so much, all of you. Handing over to you now.
Thanks, Melis. Hi, my name is Ujix Smith. I use he, him pronouns. For a visual description, I am a white masculine presenting man. I'm wearing a plain black jumper and I have short dark hair parted in the middle. I'm against a plain wall that's white, but you can see my door. It's a really great opportunity to be here, so welcome to this panel. We'll be discussing and exploring how through mentoring, LGBTQ plus elders can facilitate queer leadership and transmit the community's histories, resources to younger talents in ways that enable surviving and thriving both in personal life and within the workplace. So I think it's important to kind of talk about what we mean by intergenerational wisdom. So it's often described as like sharing and the transmission of knowledge, belief, or lived experience from one generation to the next. LGBTQ plus communities have always benefited from a really rich oral storytelling. It's been instrumental for surviving historical and systematic erasure of both queer people and their stories. It's in the workplace, however, even though there's not necessarily a clear-cut path to making it, there are countless intersectional self-leadership lessons and resources that can be shared by LGBTQ plus elders, from how to create safety, build community, to sharing guidance on well-being and meeting their psychosocial needs, self-advocacy, influencing and having an impact. Sometimes people are in workplaces where there's no roadmaps or inclusive policies in place and navigating that. So we have a really fantastic panel with us today. And we will also be doing some engagement with the audience so you guys can get involved. For those familiar with things like Mentimeter, we'll be doing some polls through that. And so I'll start with letting the panel introduce themselves. So Erica, I will start with you if that's okay.
Thank you, Ujix. Hi, everyone. My name's Erica Rose. My pronouns are she, her. And for a visual description, I'm here as an LGBTQ plus elder. So I'm just hit 50 years old last year. I'm a white cisgender female, and I've got white blonde hair. And I'm working in my home office today, surrounded by lots of colourful books. I recently left the Body Shop after a 30-year career. I was the global director of quality and health and safety, and I was also the co-founder and co-chair of our LGBTQ plus employee network or employee resource group, and a spokesperson for all of our LGBTQ plus activities that we did within the UK on behalf of the Body Shop. I'm now taking a little bit of time out before I focus on a career step, a career change, and I'm following my purpose and passion that's come through all the LGBTQ plus activities I've done in recent years to focus on moving into the world of equity, diversity, inclusion and belonging. Thank you very much, Ujix.
All right, it's really great to have you here. Next, I will pass to Jay, if that's okay.
Of course it is. I'm Jay Sloan. My pronouns are they, them. I'm really excited because I've never done a visual description before, and I get to do that for the first time today in a Zoom type setting. But I have a bald head, a beard that's slightly gray, and black glasses and a red polo. And behind me are some basically portraits of art portraits. I work independently as a consultant, coach, writer, and speaker. After having trained as a scientist and worked in a big global pharmaceutical company for 20 years. And also am one of the co-chairs of the Proud Science Alliance, which aims to amplify LGBTQ plus inclusion across the life sciences and healthcare industry. Thanks a lot for having me.
And finally, I shall pass to Mark.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Mark Thompson. My pronouns are he, him. Visual description. I like the fact that Erica said I'm an elder, so I'll describe myself as an elder. I'm an elder cisgendered Black man. I have a salt and pepper beard, so it's mostly white, so there's a little bit more salt than there is pepper. I'm wearing a navy blue shirt, and in the background, it's dark green with blinds and lots of greenery and plants and a couple of books on the wall, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm currently the co-director of a small London-based community interest company called the Love Tank that works to address health inequalities in queer and other marginalised communities. I've worked in community development, HIV and sexual health for about 30 years, running a number of organisations, and have worked for most of the big sexual health and HIV charities in the UK. I'm also a podcaster, writer, and I kind of describe myself as a creative activist. Thanks.
So we have such a fantastic panel lined up today, and we're going to start by getting you guys involved with kind of gauging where you're at. So we have a Zoom poll for you guys with 2 questions. So the first one is discussing kind of your connections and relationships with people in different generations from your own. You know, if you're of a younger generation, do you have friends and relationships in some capacity with people who are 10, 20 years older, and vice versa if you're an elder person joining us? And then the second one kind of discusses kind of barriers to mentorship. You know, this can be in any sort of setting. If mentorship is something that you've pursued or even considered, you know, have you encountered any barriers? What sort of things will stop you from pursuing mentorship? So we will give you a minute or so to fill this out so we can kind of gauge where everyone's at, where everyone's joining us from. And then we'll kind of see what comes out from that. Let's see. While we wait, we've had a quick question come through that I hope it's okay for me to ask, but someone's asked for Mark the title of your podcast, if you'd be willing to share it with us.
Yeah, sure. I will put links into the chat, but there are 3 that I've worked on and produced recently. We Were Always Here, which is a oral history of the UK HIV epidemic through unheard voices. Black and Gay Back in the Day, which again is an oral history about Black queer life, which is an intergenerational conversation. And finally, Queer Roots and Roots, which are the stories of gay migrants in London.
Awesome. So hopefully we'll be able to pass those details on to everyone so people can access that. But the poll, I believe, is now closed. So kind of results we're getting back, 88% of people have said that yes, they do actually have relationships or connections with people outside of their generation, only 12% saying no. And then with the barriers, the main one coming through at about 46% is visibility of like-minded mentors and mentees. And then I feel like a burden as a mentee is coming in quite strong as well as second place. And kind of joint last, psychological safety and not having anything to share as a mentor. So I think this is a really interesting place for us to kind of lead into some of these questions, knowing that people do have connections outside of the generations, but they're still finding these barriers to mentorship, no matter kind of as a mentor or a mentee. So I'm gonna open with asking, probably towards Erica and Jay, what does the journey to queer awareness, acceptance, and leadership look like, especially navigating fields and industries that aren't inherently aligned with marginalized identities? Did you have any queer role models in your workplaces? I'll pass to Jay, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question. I think fundamentally, each of our journeys is different depending on circumstance, context, environment, all of those things. But I think one of the factors that's quite similar across the mentoring relationships I've had, but also as a coach to those in communities, the difference is that what makes the difference, or finding ourselves, let's say, in contexts that aren't necessarily set up to make us or support our success, which is often the case, particularly in the corporate environment, is that it's a dissociation of of expectations. So within a corporate environment, there's a certain, let's say, leadership archetype that I was meant to adhere to, and it just wasn't me. I'm a queer person. I show up in a very specific way. I lead in a very specific way. So in that sense, what I had to do is say, the system isn't designed for me. So my idea of success, and also me as a person, is defined outside of that. So I had to define it for myself, but also you mentioned kind of queer role models and that sort of thing. I didn't really have any myself, but I looked to other possibilities, I would say. People that are different, let's say, than the archetype. And I think that's really what made the difference for me, at least. I don't know, Erica, what was your experience?
Yeah, there's some similarities. Yes, I think the key thing for me is that there weren't any role models, there weren't any queer leadership role models. And I think at the early stage of my career, that was probably a boundary to me being me. That probably slowed it down. And with that probably slowed down my progression, you know, my opportunities for success, but also my own personal acceptance as well, because if I couldn't be me in the workplace, then I judge myself on that, and I felt I'd have to spend energy and time editing and not being me. My acceptance actually came not from a more senior role model, because they weren't there, they just didn't exist. It came from collaborating with our employee resource group that we had at the Body Shop, that I was one of the co-founders of. That was the first time, and this being only 6 years ago, it was about 20 years ago that I came out. That was the first time I truly felt like I was being me. And even though I'd been in a fairly senior role by that point, it took coming together with colleagues within our LGBTQ+ community at the Body Shop for me to have the confidence and acceptance to be me. And I noticed a marked change in my approach to work, in my approach to being me, and my approach to stop editing me. We so often hear this, you can't be what you can't see, and we hear this quote a lot nowadays, and I didn't see any LGBTQ+ leaders at the Body Shop. There were no visible leaders. There was no one to go and be mentored by, or to seek out and advice or guidance, or even just example from. And interestingly, I mentioned at the beginning of my introduction, I've just recently left the Body Shop after 30 years. And it's interesting, when you leave a company after that long, suddenly people are very honest about how they feel about you and what you meant to them. And suddenly all these very kind messages were coming through that I hadn't heard before, which blew me away. But one of the key ones I took was a number of thank yous for being a visible gay, queer role model. And I didn't realize I was being that. You know, yes, of course I was, because I was very visible and I was a spokesperson for the Body Shop, but I didn't realize. And at that moment I realized actually I'd become the role model I wish I'd had.
Such a lovely kind of takeaway from that. But it's also, I think it touches on some interesting points of, you know, it unfortunately took for you to leave the Body Shop for some of these messages to come through, and for some of the, you know, support and how widespread. I think it's also interesting, Jay's points about like defining our own success when we don't have those leaders. So I think that in a community that doesn't necessarily have that many visible elders and leaders, I'm going to pass this one to Mark. Do you find that audiences, especially from younger generations, are receptive to those who are visible and those who are leaders in the queer community? And if not, are there barriers to navigate? How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add a really quick addendum to the point that Erica and Jay just made there as
absolutely.
well. I was quite lucky that when I got started in my career working in the HIV and sexual health sector, I had most people in my age or a few years older, lots of queer role models and people in leadership. What was missing was the intersection of ethnicity and race. So I was very often the only Black man. And as I've gone through my career, I have remained in that position. So now I am a role model and a mentor to younger Black men and people of color coming into the work in lots of different areas of queer life. So I think we also have to remember that although we may find our role models in those spaces, they may not actually have our lived experience in spite of our sexuality. But to your question, I think there are 2 points there which I think are important. I think first of all, that yes, younger people in my experience have been very receptive to the messaging, the work that I put out, that we put out as elders. And I think that that has a lot to do with trust, with the fact that you're putting out the right information and the right messaging, that you are open and willing to dialogue and to be challenged. Very often I have been challenged. I think that the conversation around our trans community is something that many of us who are older and who are mentors are having to learn. But I think that, yes, it has been, younger people are receptive. I think where the barriers lie, it goes back to that key question, key word in your question about visibility. And as somebody said in the poll, I don't know where visible mentors are. Well, actually, many of our elders are around. We're just not looking hard enough for them. They're not on social media. Many of us are getting on with our lives and we're progressing in our careers, or we may not be progressing in our careers. We may be dealing with the trauma of the 1980s and the 1990s. So I think a younger demographic has to do a little bit more work to find those people. I think particularly our queer media is not very good at representing us. You know, there's an absolute absence of older LGBTQ folk across the media landscape, but then specifically in the queer media landscape, we're completely absent. So I think those are some of the things where we can overcome that. And I would always say to people, you know, get out, volunteer, find out who your elders are. There are spaces where you can connect with us.
That's a really, really valuable insight. And I think the topic of intersectionality, especially in representation, is really important to focus on. For myself, while there was like a Pride ERG at my company, I'm the only openly trans person, potentially in the UK market, potentially in the Western Europe part of our company. We're still working that one out. So on this kind of topic of intersectionality, Erica, have you sought out mentorship opportunities at some point in like your professional or personal development? And what kind of support were you looking for, particularly as a queer woman in the workplace?
I have sought out mentors, and I have had a number of mentors. However, they've all been heterosexual, white men and women. You know, a lot of privilege there when I now look back. Yes, of course, they were helpful, because I think any mentor can be, as long as you can connect and you build that trust. They were helpful relationships, and they gave me a chance to think a lot about my life and my career, and it was a useful experience. However, and it's a big however, they didn't have the shared or similar lived experience to I had. They hadn't had to come out to their children if they had children. They hadn't had to come out to their friends and their work colleagues. They hadn't had to worry about and waste energy on editing their life at work, worrying about if they came out to work colleagues, would it be detrimental to their progression and their career? So something that might have been discussed, that might have been easy for, or easier for someone who wasn't part of the queer community, was going to be potentially additionally challenging for me, because I was already spending a lot of energy worrying about a lot of other things that they wouldn't have had lived experience. And actually, in preparing for this session today, it gave me a really useful opportunity to think back and reflect on those times, and reflect on how it could have been different. You know, what would that difference have made if I'd had, you know, a member of the queer community being my mentor? And of course, there's so many different lived experiences, you know, just because we're all part of the LGBTQ+ community, there are still so many different lived experiences, and the intersectional aspects too. However, there would have potentially been a little bit more empathy and understanding because of their own lived experiences. And I think it would have made the whole relationship of gaining support, gaining discussion with a mentor a lot more successful, and a lot more helpful to me.
That's really interesting. I think, you know, talking about how even though it might not be the exact same lived experience, being in that place in society and in that system of oppression opens you up to having the empathy of those shared kind of struggles, and kind of a solidarity that is just missing with a lot of mentors in the workplace. I think from a mentor's perspective, though, I'm going to pop back over to Mark. He touched on how some queer elders, especially with like the trans community, are learning new things and being challenged. So talking about like language and how often it's been flagged as like a barrier for this intergenerational bonding, what's been your experience with that? What sort of challenges have come up for you? What are you sort of facing?
You know, I was so glad when I saw this question, because it immediately took me back to my own journey around language. And I remember hearing the word queer being reclaimed in the early 90s, particularly the Queer Nation movement in the United States was happening, which is a kind of a radical activist movement. And in London, we adopted it as a nightclub for partying, one of the best nightclubs in London, I hasten to add. But for me, as a young gay man, I didn't subscribe to the word queer because it felt very white, it felt very radical, it felt very out there. And I didn't buy into it. So it took me a long time to get it. And a couple of examples I want to give you is when I set up Blackout in 2015, an organization dedicated to creating space for Black gay men, we had a big conversation about should we be Black gay men or should we be queer? And for many of my peers, there was a real struggle around gayness because of its association with whiteness. So there are lots of men in America, African-American men who describe themselves as same gender loving. We decided to adopt the term queer because it was inclusive, and therefore we could include trans men, we can include non-binary people who may be masculine, who may identify and take different parts of being a quote man. So for us, it was an inclusive term that we adopted, and one that I feel very proud of. I now describe myself as a gay man because I have a particular experience, a particular path and journey in life that is part of the queer family. And that queer family is rich and it's diverse and it's lots of things. But I think that what we have to recognize is that word and language has a lot of history. I had lunch last week with a 75-year-old man, completely in tune, knows all of his stuff, but said that word hurts me so much. And I understand younger people can use it, and it's great that they've reclaimed it, but I want people to understand that when I hear it, I'm taken back to being 22 and being beaten up. The other part of the conversation is that while some of us are seeing it as inclusive, there are some people, particularly in some of the trans conversation now, who are seeing that word as being exclusionary as well. So I'm seeing posts about people saying, you know, I'm a lesbian woman, I'm not queer. So again, I think it's about having a really good open dialogue and allowing, and very often we don't have the space for the dialogue and the nuance.
I think that's a really interesting insight. And from my perspective and kind of my generation, the kind of queer community that I grew up with, there's a lot of shutdown of this dialogue. I think there's this kind of need to say the right thing and use the right term and not have this discussion about how it can affect different people and how this term is reclaimed, but it can be used in circumstances with people where it can be traumatic to bring up. But instead it's kind of this very almost cut and dry, this is right, this is wrong. And I think that we really lost this aspect of an open dialogue. And I'm gonna pop over to Jay now. I feel like I've been ignoring you a little bit. So I want to talk about kind of contracting and boundaries and showing up authentically in a mentorship and the cost of that. How do you approach protecting and mitigating the risk to yourself as a marginalized person while also advocating for people in your community? What are some of the most important considerations when setting up a successful mentorship relationship? Oh, you're muted.
Thought I clicked the button. I'll speak primarily as a mentor, but I think the same principles hold true whether you're coming to mentoring as a mentee as well. But the key word there being sort of contract or boundaries, and that's simply a simple way to say that what are you after? What are the kind of rules of engagement, however you want to describe it? Like, how are we going to be in relationship? And I think that's really key. From my perspective as a mentor, I typically just want to create psychological safety for people to bring themselves. And the way to do that is just ask them questions about why are you here? What are you after? What are some of the goals and such that you're looking for? But also, what drew you to me? You know, because typically I have some sort of profile, or they found me online or something like that, or somebody recommended them. So I just asked them, you know, straight away, what is it about me that you thought would be helpful? or good. And so I think through that dialogue, then you kind of get to this place where you're like, and then, you know, like what's going to be the most helpful for you, you know, to support you and to achieve your outcomes. And a lot of times that's practicalities, you know, around how often do we want to meet. That's a way to protect myself too, because I can say what I can offer, you know, is a certain amount of time over, of course, a period of time. I think also kind of time bound it, saying, why don't we do this for 6 months and see how we go? And then come to the place where we can contract or recontract, you know, for more sessions, that sort of thing. But also I like to come to the mentoring relationship very openly, being very descriptive about my identity and my experience, you know, and being very open about that. So regardless of where somebody's coming from, whether they're queer or straight, typically I work with people from communities of difference across the spectrum. And so by being very open about myself, and it invites them to be open about themselves too. I think as a mentor, it's also really important to understand the difference between mentoring and therapy and other sorts of interactions. And I'm very clear on those boundaries too. And so when I notice something like that coming into the relationship, I'm able to say, I'm here with you. I have empathy. I support you. What I'm noticing is this is something like a topic that would probably you'd be better served working with a therapist. And that's what I would recommend that you do. Not that I don't want to talk about it, but I care about you and I want you to understand that. But yeah, just kind of setting those boundaries. Those are a couple of examples. I think, as I mentioned, if you're a mentee coming to the relationship, I have that experience as well. And so the principles really hold true. I think the one thing that I would probably call out is that as a mentee, I always came to the relationship very clear about what it is that I was after and looking for. And I showed up to sessions with some idea, you know, of what I was dealing with or questions I was holding that I needed some help to and support around, that sort of thing. And so I think that's helpful. That gives you, I think, a starting point around boundaries and what protects you in terms of your identity and your energy and that sort of thing. Likewise, as mentees, I hope that was also helpful.
I think that's a really, really insightful answer, and kind of links with what Mark was saying about having these open conversations and dialogues. I know from my experience being offered mentorship in the workplace as someone who's very new to like corporate life, I kind of didn't know what mentorship was. And the only way to really navigate that is to be open and honest, have these communications and put cards on the table, say, I don't know what this is what I think I want from it. And having that kind of open dialogue, I think, is a huge, you know, part of this. We can't share intergenerational wisdom unless we're honest and open with our communication. And talking about like mentorship, especially in like kind of corporate settings, Erica, you've obviously had such a fantastic career with the Body Shop. So what is the role of intergenerational mentorship for the future of LGBTQ plus inclusion and corporate queer leadership?
Well, I think intergenerational mentoring can help share history and lived experience from all members and from different people within the LGBTQ plus community. It can help to minimize assumptions that everybody's experienced the same thing. And as I said earlier, that there's so many different lived experiences. Also, it can help explain why people from different generations within the LGBTQ plus community will act differently. Mark talked about the use of the word queer, the term queer. Yeah, you know, when I started out in my working life, it wasn't a word that was used favorably. It was a derogatory word, and that change has been massive to see, and to see a younger generation come through and now own that term with all the added complexity that Mark explained. But that's one example, and I think to have that understanding that what you may feel is acceptable within your 20s may not be seen in the same way from someone within the community in their 50s. That's where intergenerational mentorship will be at its best to help bridge those gaps, to help bridge that understanding. Also, I come back to what I said earlier, that term of you can't be who you can't see. So if you're being mentored by someone who's maybe a senior leader within the company you work for, then you see that as a possibility, as a real possibility that you can be that person, you can be that role, and actually who you are. And as a member of the LGBTQ plus community isn't going to necessarily stop you or act as a barrier for you. I think as a resulting factor of all of this, then you have the opportunity, or we have the opportunity, to create more opportunities, for success for LGBTQ plus leaders. So of course there's talent out there, and sometimes that talent may have been restricted from living its full potential. So this is where the whole, argument and basis for EDIB comes into play, that if you can open up that wider talent pool and give more people opportunities, you have the potential to have someone living and breathing their true potential and their true talent, and so performing better for the company that they work in. Let alone then what, as a company, if you're a customer facing company, what it means to connecting with your customers and your external customers as well. It also then comes back to the energy that can be used by LGBTQ plus leaders, colleagues, that can be put into their work, into that potential to be a leader. And of course, with it comes the intersectional advantages as well. Of course, a better empathy and a better understanding of all minority groups that can help open the doors and maybe open the opportunities for a lot of marginalized people.
I think that's a really good point, especially about kind of the equality, diversity, and inclusion. We tend to have conversations a lot with people who are allies in diversity sections of their workplace, and who are trying to put across why it's important to have visible people in the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's very much almost attracting this talent, because queer people are more likely to flock somewhere where they can see that it's safe for them to do so by the presence of like visible queer elders, and even just policies that are inclusive. So I think that's a really, really good point to like bring up. And I think speaking about like kind of the more corporate ERG kind of side of things, Jay, I'm going to come back to you for a bit. Do you think organizations can leverage ERG networks to ensure a tangible and like lasting legacy for LGBTQ plus professionals at work? Do you have some practices that you could share if you think so?
Yeah, I mean, 100% yes. I think the answer is simple. I think I'll just share a couple of thoughts around this because it's quite complex. I would say the answer as a whole, but I think a couple of the key points is that I think oftentimes I've noticed some organizations use their employee networks as either tokenisms or some kind of performative ritual, to somehow indicate we're inclusive. We have an employee network. Isn't that amazing? We love queer people. But in fact, in practice, what is better is if they set them up, but also give them a little bit of autonomy. And instead of leverage, I think the word that I would use is partner. So there's questions that an organization is holding, and queer people from our lived experience have the answers. So why wouldn't you? In many different instances, kind of connect and partner in that way. I think from an ERG perspective or employee network, because I'm sure we have some people on the call today who are leaders, are part of networks, is that we also have a certain accountability, if we're engaged in, to simply stated, speak truth to power, which sounds really intense, and it can be, and there's some hesitation to do that when there's a lot of risk involved sometimes. But I think when you're able to, and when you're given the opportunity, I think that's the key, in lots of different ways. Sometimes, for example, you can create space for storytelling. That creates space for truth telling. you know, so I can talk about my lived experience and people are invited in and there's no barriers, you know, to whoever can show up. Other times it could be that the CEO is asking you, what do you think we need to do to make things differently here? And instead of saying, oh, I think you're amazing, it's great, you know, and I've heard this conversation, I'm the one that's like, it's not okay, you know, and I'll tell you what is wrong. But I think finally what I would say, just to kind of keep it concise, is that there is an element of constantly saying this is wrong, everything's wrong, you know, it's not good enough, which is there's an important part to be played around protest, around saying things aren't wrong. I think my approach, particularly in a corporate environment in an employee network situation, is to say these things aren't right, but also these are the things that we can do. In fact, we're already working in this way and trying to affect change, you know. So I think that loops back to the start, which is around partnership. So I'm not here to tell you everything that's wrong with your company from a career perspective. I'm here to point out where things aren't as good as they could be, but also say, and also I'm ready to get to work and help and figure things out. And so in that sense, what you do is create a legacy of change. And I'll stop there, otherwise I'll keep going because I love this topic.
I think that's a really good point. There's a quote I read recently from Tate Smith, who also works with We Create Space occasionally, talking about how sometimes in a workplace, you know, when they don't have like kind of policies in place and they're trying to collaborate with ERGs, sometimes they just need like a trans person or a queer person in the workplace to be able to view things through that lens. And it's like, you know, if you're not part of the community, you might not necessarily see where the holes in your policies are or why it's important to codify certain things into your policies. And sometimes just having that partnership and seeing it as a partnership, I think is a really interesting perspective and really important. As I'm going to wrap up with one final point for Mark, something that I kind of wanted to kind of bring forth as a question, because I see a lot in my generation of the community, this sense of reinventing the wheel and not looking at what's already been done, starting from scratch and feeling like we almost, because we lost so many elders during the 80s and 90s, that we have nothing to fall back on and that it's not been done before, even though that's not necessarily true. I mean, you're all here. So specifically, you mentioned how having like a risk mitigation framework for HIV was really useful with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was wondering, could this inspire different strategies to ensure LGBTQ plus people not only survive, but thrive, and especially during times of social political turbulence?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that the period that we lived through and we survived, and I think it's also important to remember, we didn't just live through a HIV epidemic, we lived through a rabid, homophobic, viscerally violent time. This is, in the UK in particular, we also had to deal with Clause 28, and in the US you had a right-wing Republican government in the guise of Reagan and then Bush. So these two forces aligned. So I think that what should inspire us is that we can connect as a community. When the chips are down, we can connect. Queer men, queer women, trans people, non-binary people, we can all connect around an issue. Very often it's about trying to put aside the minutiae and allowing, again, that nuance to come into our conversation and dialogue. And I think what we also need to recognize is it isn't always an attack on us around our identity or our sexuality. These things are wrapped up in the intersections of life. So the current attack on trans people, the link to attacks on drag queen story time, these are all connected. And then we have to look at what's going on in places like Uganda right now, you know, on the African continent. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of keep our eyes open, recognize where those dots are. And if the Daily Mail are coming for migrants in small boats, they are coming for drag queens next week. So we have to fight for those migrants, because those migrants are coming from war-torn countries where they may be facing homophobia. So whilst we may think in some ways we've got it good here, we're okay. Do you know what I mean? We've got gay marriage, we've got PrEP, we can be on TV, we can do all of these wonderful things. Those freedoms are a whisper of being taken away. So we always need to be alert and constantly try to find the connections between us and not the differences. And I think that will be our failing. Understand the connections and not the small differences, because they're tiny differences.
I very heavily agree with Leslie Feinberg. If people are familiar, is one of my favorite kind of queer advocates, academics, and she's got this fantastic quote in one of the speeches she gives, where before the rainbow flag was, created and the banner that queer people could gather under, they used the North Vietnamese flag, because while they weren't the same issue, they realized that it was a mutual struggle, and how this connection of different, marginalizations can ultimately make us stronger as a whole. Kind of like you were saying, if they're attacking migrants, they're coming for drag shows, and it's banding together, using the intergenerational wisdom that we have to become stronger, both as a community individually, but also as a populace, and finding those things that bridge us together. I think that's a really fantastic way to wrap up this discussion. I'm actually going to give the floor now to everybody else, and we're going to go through some Q&As. So you can obviously submit some Q&As through Zoom. I'll have a quick look through the chat as well if people want to pop stuff there. But having listened to our panelists and this kind of conversation that we've been having, if you have any questions, this is your time to ask and we'll try and answer them. So we have one already actually, from Carla, and I'll open this up so anybody who wants to answer, you can chip in. So how can one find a job doing mentoring and coaching and or work in DE&I when one has been an elder queer and a trans IT person and now phased out due to age and not fitting in? I'll kind of give you a couple seconds to think about an answer to that one. I think the point that really stood out to me here is dealing with being an elder in a workplace where inherently as an elder, you're at a disadvantage and more likely to be phased out. A lot of companies are always chasing younger employees, and there's that kind of like ageism discrimination. So it's like, if somebody does want to be a mentor, looking for those opportunities in a workplace that doesn't welcome them, I think is an interesting one. So if anyone has any insight, I'll pass it over to you guys.
I'll share a little bit of feedback. It may not answer the whole question, and it's quite a challenging one to answer, because there's probably a number of people that would like to have the answers to that one. There's different resources out there. There's different companies. There are companies that are thinking forward, from a complete EDIB perspective, and encompassing age as well. I think we're at a pivotal part of society where age is now becoming a category that's being looked into, and actually trying to be ruled out, and to see the benefits and the wisdom that can come with having older colleagues join your workforce, especially with the fact that people are living longer and they want to keep their careers going longer. There is a lot of talent and there is a lot of information to be shared. My quick go-to would be finding companies that are thinking forward. LinkedIn's great. You can find a lot of people there representing different companies that are big voices within the EDI sector, and so are promoting and supporting companies that are getting it right, or organizations, not just companies. So that would be my quick go-to, my quick answer.
Fantastic.
And I'd really quickly say that, Carla, it sounds like you've got some great lived experience there already. And Erica used a statement earlier, which was, if you can't see it, how can you be it? I've reframed that. If you can't see it, build it. And all throughout my career, there has been an absence of work for men that look like me. So I have created it myself. It's challenging, it's hard, it doesn't pay very well, but I create it and then people follow. So I would say, get out there, push yourself as a mentor, let people know that you have these skills outside of the corporate world, in your social circles, you know, if you're on social media, put yourself there. That could be a way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't have much to add because I completely agree with that. That's what I do. I was done with the system, stepped out of the system. Now I created the work that I want to do.
Yeah.
But I think an important point too is that I hear this a lot, you know, about people wanting to work in EDI, do coaching and mentoring. I think the question to ask ourselves, all of us, I need to ask this question: is that the work I'm meant to do? It's a tough one, isn't it? You know, because we have this need and desire, and we're all empathetic, and we want to be involved in the queer community or support other people. But frankly, not all of us are designed or here to do that work. You know, there's lots of different opportunities. So it's like, it's figuring out, you know, is that really the calling? Is that really what you want to do? And I think, but I think I'd go back to what Mark said too. Once you ask that question, it's like, yes, you know, then there's ways to volunteer, there's training available, you know, getting engaged, involved. And I would reiterate this point, it's hard. It's so hard. And so make sure you have the community around you of people that support you in the decisions you make, and find people like this, you know, that will say, when you're down, saying you're amazing, and remind you of that truth.
I think that's very valuable and kind of like wraps up a lot of some of the questions coming through. A lot of them are discussing how to become a mentor, how to find a mentor. And I think sometimes it is just a case of, you know, if you don't have those structures in place, if there isn't a mentorship program that you can sign up for, building that, you know, whether it can be in like social life, social media, or just talking to people who you don't normally talk to in your business, you know, kind of putting yourself out there. I think that's a very, very valuable kind of, it takes courage. Like you guys say, the mentorship itself is difficult to do, but even beginning that process can be very difficult. And I think for a mentee as well, it can be difficult to reach out and connect with them because there's so much unknown from a mentee position myself. I sometimes don't know what's expected of a mentee, or, you know, what we should be getting out of this. And I think a lot of it is, as we've said, opening this dialogue and just having the floor open and honest. So because of time, I am going to wrap it up here. There's some very, very fantastic questions, but I will pass back to Malis for now.
Thank you so much, Ujix, Erica, Jay, and Mark. Some really good questions actually kept coming into the chat. I'm not sure if any of the panelists have the time or the bandwidth to kind of reply, but there was an interesting point about reverse mentorship and what that looks like potentially from the elder learning from the younger person. So I think that's worth considering. But we've had some awesome little takeaways kind of flutter in our Mentimeter feed. And as you can see, we see that intersectionality is often missing within leadership, LGBTQ+ leadership spaces. And we're also seeing that we may find kind of role models in spaces, but again, that intersectionality piece, they may not have or share our lived experience. Visibility, as Mark was talking about, is this kind of, you know, ultimate barriers as well. Language also coming into consideration, and how we, you know, bring forward like a collective agreement and, you know, collective reflections on, you know, where we're going, what suits us, but also recognizing that the language we use also is quite versatile in a way that it has been used, and that also hurt can stem from this. But so many interesting elements there as well around, you know, changing that word, leveraging, speaking about ERGs, collaboration with organizations, and thinking about partnership collaboration to create this lasting legacy. So much was shared, and I'm so thankful, Erica, as well, really bringing into, you know, the forefront this, you can't beat what you can't see, and Mark saying, well, actually, if you can't see it, build it. And I think many of us have felt that way. So how do we empower each other to, you know, find the resources, the tools, and spaces like these are super helpful in doing that. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm just looking at time, and I also have a 1-year-old like literally tapping away at my laptop to tell me it's time. to go on the little break. But what we'd love for everyone to do, those who are still in the space, we have a little feedback survey available there. You can scan the QR code or go straight to the page or use the link that's dropped in the chat. Please share your thoughts, anything else that you're taking away, what more you'd like to hear from. But we'd love to just gauge, you know, I don't want to say the importance, but the weight that some of these conversations are actually are taking up in our minds, in our work, and all of these additional considerations. So please share with us. We're back next week for, looks like not the last one, but just an additional session closing as we move to close the month that's running so fast. But we'll be exploring financial well-being, how we go about negotiating worth and better financial outcomes for LGBTQ+ people. So a lot of conversation, a lot of topics to unpack there, self-worth, also all of the other elements that come into our lived experiences, but sometimes challenge us moving that step forward. And yeah, really looking forward to bringing other powerful voices to this space. So this leaves me with just 2 more minutes for those filling out the survey, but last rounds of thank yous to Ujix for moderating the session and really bringing his personal experience and everything else that he sees. Because Ujix and I, we've had the opportunity of working before, but it's great to see him step forward and moderate this call. Erica, Jane, Mark, as always, just love spending time learning and learning again from all of the enriching experiences that you bring to these spaces, to this work, and the support that you help create throughout the community. So thank you so much, everyone. Hope to see you next week.